Remember when food regulations felt more like casual advice than actual rules? The 1980s brought some chaotic moments to American kitchens. What ended up on dinner tables back then might surprise you today, or even land you in trouble with the law. From grocery store go-to-us to diner classics, items we once ate without a second thought are now banned, tightly controlled, or completely off-limits, some for public health concerns, others to protect vulnerable species. Yet all were staples during the Reagan-era lifestyle, ready to take a nostalgic, slightly disturbing journey back in time. Let's dive into the foods that shifted from standard fare to strictly forbidden in just a few short decades. Raw milk products. In the 1980s, drinking milk straight from the source wasn't just a countryside habit, it became a rising trend in suburban neighborhoods. Two people would travel to local farms, bring along containers, and fill them with creamy, rich, unpasteurized milk. Never heated or altered. Health stores and farmers markets sold it openly with little interference. The common belief was that pasteurization removed helpful enzymes and ruined the natural nutrient balance. Many nutritionists and even doctors back then recommended it, especially for kids and those with gut problems. But what most people didn't realize was the danger lurking inside. Raw milk may carry bacteria such as E. coli, listeria, or Salmonella. Following several outbreaks of illness in the mid-1980s, including ones that impacted children, the FDA stepped in. By 1987, they had prohibited interstate distribution of raw milk items, and states began putting their own policies in place. Today, human consumption of raw milk is totally outlawed in nearly half of all U.S. states, and strictly limited in most others. What families once saw as a health food can now lead to dairy closures, confiscated goods, and major penalties for sellers. Redfish blackened. When chef Paul Prudhomme unveiled his iconic blackened redfish dish in 1980, he sparked a culinary trend unlike anything America had seen before. His New Orleans eatery pools was overwhelmed with demand, and soon eateries across the country began featuring this fiery Cajun creation on their menus. The mix of a spice-crusted sear and juicy, tasty fish became a must-have dish in both upscale restaurants and laid-back dining spots. Home chefs gave it a go too, often setting off fire alarms thanks to the blazing hot pans needed for cooking. Demand for Gulf redfish, or red drum, soared overnight. Commercial fisheries rushed to cash in on the craze, with some boats focusing solely on redfish. Harvests jumped from just 2.5 million to nearly 13 million each year in only a short span. No one paused to question if the supply could last. By 1986, the redfish population had crashed so badly that the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council stepped in with a commercial fishing ban in federal waters. Soon after, Gulf states passed their own tough laws. Today, catching wild redfish for profit is either banned or tightly regulated in most of the region. The once routine redfish haul of the 1980s would now invite steep fines and even gear confiscation. Beluga caviar. In the 1980s, nothing screamed elegance more than a dainty dollop of beluga caviar on a blini topped with creme fraiche. This luxury treat from the Caspian Seas, beluga sturgeon, stood as a status symbol at elite dinner gatherings and top-tier restaurants across the U.S. High-end stores like Neiman Marcus and Saks Fifth Avenue stocked beluga tins, especially during festive months. Though pricey, it was widely accessible to anyone with a budget. Gift baskets featuring petite tins of beluga were trendy among corporate elites, reflecting wealth and refined taste. America consumed close to 60% of global beluga caviar in the 1980s, rarely questioning its origins. The distinctive large gray-black eggs were sought after for their subtle flavor and became a symbol of exclusivity among the wealthy. What most caviar lovers didn't realize was that the beluga sturgeon was being fished to the brink of extinction. These ancient creatures require up to 20 years to reach full reproductive age, and their numbers couldn't keep up with the relentless fishing. By 2005, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to step in, banning beluga caviar imports under the Endangered Species Act. Today, Selling or importing wild beluga caviar is entirely illegal in the U.S., with penalties reaching up to $250,000 and even possible prison sentences. Haggis. During the cultural revival of the 1980s, traditional Scottish haggis found new popularity in the U.S., especially among Scottish Americans eager to honor their heritage. This blend of sheep's heart, liver, and lungs, mixed with oats, onions, spices, and suet, was all stuffed into a sheep's stomach lining. Burns night celebrations on January 25th grew more common that decade, with haggis as the centerpiece. Scottish festivals across the U.S. served it, and specialty butchers in cities with large Scottish communities made it. Following age-old recipes, food publications occasionally spotlighted haggis in stories about global cuisines, while adventurous eaters embraced it as a cultural tradition. Though never mainstream, authentic Scottish haggis was legally imported and sold in select food stores. That changed in 1989, when the USDA banned foods with sheep lung, a key component of true haggis. The concern was the risk of contamination from scrappy, a disease similar to mad cow disease. Though this didn't outright ban haggis, the prohibition on lung meat effectively rendered traditional Scottish haggis illegal today. Importing real Scottish haggis remains forbidden, and American-made versions must exclude the lung meat that makes it authentic. Its unique texture and taste, once enjoyed openly by Scottish Americans in the 1980s, is now considered contraband if prepared using traditional methods. Chilean sea bass. Patagonian toothfish in the 1980s, a relatively unknown fish, underwent a smart rebranding and quickly became a favorite among high-end American restaurants. The Patagonian toothfish, now marketed as Chilean sea bass, was found on menus everywhere. From luxury dining spots to wedding banquet, chefs loved its versatility, as the high fat content made it hard to overcook, and its delicate flavor complemented almost any sauce. Customers couldn't get enough of the flaky, buttery white fish, and demand skyrocketed through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Seafood wholesalers rushed to meet the growing need, with fishing fleets traveling farther into the southern oceans to capture more of this hot new delicacy. Few ever questioned its origins or the sustainability of the fishery. However, what no one realized was that Chilean sea bass grows at an alarmingly slow rate, taking 10 to 12 years to mature enough to reproduce. By the late 1990s, populations had plummeted to the point of commercial extinction. In 2002, the Take a Pass on Chilean Sea Bass campaign was launched, urging chefs and consumers to avoid serving it, and international bodies imposed strict catch limits. Today, selling illegally caught Chilean sea bass can result in harsh penalties, including substantial fines and possible jail time. While certified sustainable sources are available, much of what was freely sold in the 1980s would now lead to serious legal repercussions for sellers. Sassafras root tea. Throughout the 1980s, sassafras root tea remained a popular home remedy, especially in Appalachian and southern U.S. regions. People brewed the fragrant, spicy root to create a tea with a flavor reminiscent of root beer, which was believed to cleanse the blood, ease rheumatism, and serve as an overall health tonic. Health food stores sold dried sassafras roots and bark, and herbal medicine books frequently recommended it for a variety of health issues. Some small beverage brands even produced bottled sassafras tea and root beer using the natural oils from the plant. Now, if you've been enjoying this nostalgic journey through America's banned foods, consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is below. Your membership helps us dive deeper into these captivating food history tales and bring you even more high-quality content about how our eating habits have evolved over time. Plus, Patreon members get exclusive access to extended research notes and early previews of upcoming videos. Now, let's keep exploring these once familiar foods that would now land you in serious trouble. Today, the FDA had technically banned sassafras as a food ingredient in 1976 after research linked safrole, a compound found in sassafras oil, to liver cancer in lab animals, but enforcement remained lax, and its traditional use continued largely uninterrupted throughout the 1980s, especially in rural communities. By the early 1990s, however, the FDA stepped up enforcement, demanding that commercially sold sassafras products be free of safrole. Today, selling traditional sassafras root tea with safrole is illegal, and only products made with safrole-free extracts can be legally sold as food or beverages. Queen conch in the 1980s. Queen conch was a common sight on menus in Florida and Caribbean bordering states. This large sea snail, known for its firm, white meat, featured in fritters, chowders, ceviches, and salads across coastal America's seafood markets in Florida sold conch meat openly, and tourists often took home conch shells as mementos without any restrictions. Restaurants offering Caribbean fare showcased conch in a variety of dishes, and cookbooks from that time often included conch recipes without any mention of sustainability concerns. During this period, harvesting was almost entirely unregulated in many regions, with both commercial and recreational collection happening year-round. The stunning spiral shells were also sought after in the souvenir market, putting further strain on wild populations. By the mid-1980s, conch populations had dwindled drastically due to overfishing. Florida shut down its commercial queen conch fishery in 1986, but enforcement remained inconsistent throughout the 1980s, and imported conch continued to be readily available. Today, harvesting queen conch is strictly banned in Florida waters, and importing queen conch is closely monitored under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species (CITES). Violators face heavy fines and even potential criminal charges. What was once casual conch consumption in the 1980s now brings serious legal repercussions for restaurants and vendors. Horsemeat. Though never as widespread as beef or pork, horsemeat was legally sold in certain parts of the U.S. during the 1980s. Some butcher shops, particularly in areas with cultural ties to traditions that included horsemeat, offered it as an alternative red meat. Horsemeat was valued for its sweet, unique flavor, lean texture, and high protein content. Some specialty cookbooks featured recipes for horse steaks or roasts, and a few daring restaurants in large cities quietly served it to those seeking something unconventional during times of economic hardship. Horsemeat occasionally gained traction as a cheaper alternative to pricier meats. It was also recommended by health-focused cookbooks of the era for its nutritional benefits, boasting more protein and less fat than beef. Public opinion began to shift in the late 1980s as concerns over animal welfare grew. While no federal law directly banned horsemeat for human consumption, a number of states passed their own bans and restrictions on horse slaughterhouses. By 2007, Congress had effectively imposed a nationwide ban by cutting funds for USDA inspections of horse slaughterhouses, making it nearly impossible to legally produce horsemeat for human consumption. Today, selling horsemeat for food is virtually illegal across the U.S., with violations carrying heavy fines. Absinthe. The allure of genuine absinthe fascinated many Americans during the 1980s, even though the traditional High-Thu-Joan formula had been prohibited for decades. Underground bars, especially in artistic hubs like New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans. Sometimes, smuggled bottles of the authentic version were served to those in the know. The distinctive green liquor, with its anise flavor, was surrounded by myths about its supposed hallucinogenic effects and its connection to famous artists and writers. Some travelers would bring back bottles from Europe, where laws differed by country, and private parties occasionally featured homemade batches. While technically illegal, enforcement was lax, and many Americans were able to sample the real absinthe without facing consequences. The ritual of slowly dripping water over a sugar cube into the liquor, watching it cloud, added to its mystique as a forbidden pleasure. The ban originated from early 20th century fears that thujone, a compound from wormwood in traditional absinthe, caused hallucinations and insanity. Though modern studies have shown that these concerns were largely unfounded, traditional absinthe did indeed contain potentially dangerous levels of thujone. Today, selling high thujone absinthe is still prohibited in the U.S., although versions with regulated thujone levels became legal again in 2007. The original recipe, circulating secretly in the 1980s, would still result in legal trouble if sold today, both with the FDA and ATF. Ortolan bunting in the 1980s. A small songbird known as the Ortolan bunting became a symbol of culinary exclusivity among the U.S. elite and serious food enthusiasts. This French delicacy was prepared through a controversial process, where the birds were trapped, blinded, force-fed, drowned in Armagnac, and then roasted whole. High-end French restaurants in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco occasionally served this dish to their wealthiest clients. Though it was never listed on menus, private chefs for affluent families would prepare it for special occasions, and some American food lovers traveling to France specifically sought out this forbidden treat. The bizarre tradition involved diners covering their heads with napkins, supposedly to shield their shame from God, and consuming the entire bird, bones and all, except for the beak. France banned the capture of ortolans in 1999 due to dwindling populations, though restrictions on the practice had already been tightening throughout. In the 1980s and 1990s, the U.S. Migratory Bird Treaty Act technically prohibited the killing or possession of ortolan, but enforcement in high-end restaurants was nearly non-existent until later years. Today, serving ortolan is strictly forbidden in both the United States and France, with severe legal repercussions for chefs or restaurants caught serving it. What was once a secret indulgence for the ultra-wealthy is now recognized as both cruel and ecologically harmful. Orange roughy. The distinctive, firm white flesh of orange roughy became a seafood sensation in the 1980s, previously known by the less appetizing name slimehead. This deep-sea fish began appearing on restaurant menus nationwide, and in the frozen seafood sections of major supermarkets. Consumers were drawn to its mild flavor and versatility. It could be baked, broiled, fried, or grilled. Restaurants made it a staple, often featuring it as the catch of the day, and food magazines offered countless orange roughy recipes. Red Lobster and other seafood chains made it a signature item throughout the decade. What few understood was that orange roughy can live up to 150 years and doesn't reach reproductive maturity until around age 30. These slow-growing fish simply couldn't handle the heavy commercial fishing that began in the late 1970s and exploded in the 1980s. By the 1990s, orange roughy populations had fallen by more than 90% in many regions. International fishing management organizations established strict harvesting limits and closed off some fishing zones entirely to allow the species to recover. Today, selling orange roughy caught in protected zones or beyond strict international quotas is illegal, with violations leading to hefty fines and potential vessel seizure. While legally caught orange roughy is still available, the unrestricted fishing that was commonplace in the 1980s would now lead to serious legal penalties. Fugu puffer fish. The 1980s saw Japanese cuisine enter mainstream American culture, bringing with it an obsession with fugu. The infamous pufferfish, containing a deadly neurotoxin with no known antidote, was never widely available, but underground fugu dining experiences thrived in cities with large Japanese communities like Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. Preparing fugu requires special training to safely remove the toxic organs, especially the liver and ovaries. In Japan, chefs undergo years of training and must be licensed, but in 1980s America, regulations were barely enforced. Some restaurants illegally imported fugu, while others used legally imported fish but hired unlicensed chefs. To prepare it, the thrill of consuming something potentially lethal made fugu a sought-after dish for culinary risk-takers, and those looking to flaunt their status. A full fugu meal could cost hundreds of dollars, making it a symbol of luxury and adventure. The slight tingling sensation some reported, while eating it, only added to its mystique. The FDA knew about these practices, but enforcement was uneven throughout the decade. As Japanese cuisine gained popularity, authorities began focusing more on restaurants serving dangerous dishes. Today, strict FDA regulations prohibit the import or serving of fugu unless the restaurant employs specially licensed chefs and sources the fish from certified suppliers. The underground fugu dining experiences of the 1980s would now lead to restaurant closures, product seizures, and even potential criminal charges. Trans fat-laden margarine. The 1980s marked the height of margarine consumption in America, with nearly every household containing a tub or stick of this butter alternative, marketed as the healthier option due to its lower saturated fat content. What few discussed was that most margarine contained unhealthy levels of artificial trans fats. Food manufacturers created these trans fats by hydrogenating vegetable oils, turning them into semi-solid fats with a longer shelf life. The result was a spreadable product that was cheaper than butter and had a longer shelf life, making it a kitchen staple for cooking, baking, and spreading on toast. Health authorities even recommended margarine over butter throughout the 1980s, with the American Heart Association and many doctors specifically advising consumers to make the switch. Television commercials promoted margarine as a heart-healthy alternative to butter. It wasn't until the 1990s that research began connecting trans fats to an increased risk of heart disease, leading to findings that revealed they were actually far worse than the saturated fats they replaced. Trans fats not only raised bad LDL cholesterol, but also lowered good HDL cholesterol. In 2015, the FDA determined that artificial trans fats were no longer considered safe and gave manufacturers 3 years to remove them from food products. Today, selling foods containing artificial trans fats above minimal levels is prohibited. In the United States, the margarine health experts endorsed in the 1980s would now be illegal to produce or sell unpasteurized soft cheeses. The gourmet cheese boom of the 1980s introduced Americans to a world far beyond processed cheese slices. Suddenly, authentic French soft ripened cheeses became a must-have for elegant dinner parties and upscale restaurant cheese plates. Many of these imported cheeses were made with unpasteurized milk, following centuries-old European traditions. Cheese shops and specialty food stores openly sold these raw milk varieties, touting their complex flavors and authentic character. Food magazines even published guides on serving them properly, including perfect wine pairings. At the time, FDA regulations regarding unpasteurized cheese imports were either loosely enforced or contained loopholes that importers exploited. There was also a thriving gray market for bringing these cheeses into the country through personal luggage or informal channels. After several listeriosis outbreaks linked to unpasteurized dairy products, the FDA began enforcing a long-standing but previously overlooked regulation, requiring all cheese made from unpasteurized milk to be aged for at least 60 days before sale. This effectively banned traditional soft-ripened cheeses, which are typically aged for shorter periods. Today, selling authentic unpasteurized versions of soft cheeses, like traditional brie and many others, is illegal unless they meet the 60-day aging requirement, which alters their typical texture and flavor. The European cheese boards that sophisticated hosts served in the 1980s would now result in product seizures and penalties for importers and sellers. Shark fin soup. Throughout the 1980s, shark fin soup remained a symbol of prosperity and honor at Chinese-American weddings, business banquets, and cultural celebrations. This traditional dish featured the cartilaginous fins of sharks in a flavorful broth, often enhanced with chicken, ham, and mushrooms. High-end Chinese restaurants in cities like San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles regularly served shark fin soup, sometimes charging over $100 per bowl. Specialty markets in Chinatowns across America openly sold dried shark fins for home preparation of this prestigious dish. The harvesting method, known as shark finning, involved catching sharks, cutting off their fins, and then throwing the often still living animals back into the ocean to die, a practice few Americans were aware of at the time. There were no regulations against shark finning in U.S. waters until 1993, as awareness of the ecological damage grew in the 1990s and 2000s. Shark fin soup became increasingly controversial. Scientists warned that shark populations were plummeting due to the shark fin trade, with some species declining by more than 90% today. Selling or distributing shark fins is completely illegal in 14 U.S. states, including California, New York, and Texas, which have large Chinese American populations. The Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act, passed in 2019, made the buying and selling of shark fins illegal in the United States. The once prestigious dish, served at countless celebrations in the 1980s, would now result in significant fines and legal penalties for restaurants or markets selling it. Red dye number 2. The vibrant red color in many favorite foods of the 1980s often came from artificial colorings, including various red dyes that remained in use despite growing safety concerns. While red dye number 2 had been banned in 1976 after studies linked it to cancer, similar red colorings continued to be widely used in food products, everything from candies and popsicles to breakfast cereals and fruit punches got their bright red color from synthetic dyes. Parents thought nothing of it when their kids' tongues turned bright red from candy, or when their fruit punch left colorful stains on clothing. School cafeterias served red-colored foods and drinks. Birthday parties featured vividly colored treats, and red food dye was a staple ingredient in home baking. The bright colors were seen as fun and appealing, especially for children's products. Many imported foods continued using red dye number 2 well into the 1980s as enforcement at ports of entry was inconsistent. Other red dyes with similar chemical structures remained approved despite mounting evidence of potential health risks, particularly hyperactivity in children. Today, using the original red dye number 2 in food products is completely illegal in the United States, and even other artificial red colorings face stricter regulation and must carry warning labels in some jurisdictions. The brightly colored foods that were in practically every kid's lunchbox in the 1980s would now potentially violate food safety regulations in their original formulations. Bush meat in the 1980s. A small but significant trade in African bushmeat existed in certain American cities with large immigrant populations from West and Central Africa. This umbrella term refers to wild animals hunted for food in African forests, including various species of primates, rodents, antelope, and other wildlife. Specialized markets in cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta sometimes discreetly sold bush meat to customers from countries where it was a traditional food. It would arrive through informal channels, often disguised as other meat products or brought in personal luggage. Community celebrations and cultural events occasionally featured these traditional foods. Most Americans were unaware of this underground trade, but for some immigrant communities, these foods represented an important cultural connection to their homelands. The health risks associated with consuming potentially disease-carrying wildlife weren't widely understood at the time. Everything changed after several Ebola outbreaks in Africa were linked to bushmeat consumption. The HIV/AIDS crisis also raised awareness about zoonotic diseases, those that can jump from animals to humans. Scientists identified bushmeat as a potential vector for various dangerous pathogens. Today, importing virtually all forms of bushmeat is strictly prohibited under multiple U.S. laws, including the Lacey Act and various endangered species protections. Enforcement at ports of entry has intensified dramatically, with heavy fines and potential prison sentences for smugglers. What was once a quiet cultural practice in certain immigrant communities during the 1980s now carries serious legal consequences. Unpasteurized fruit juices, fresh squeezed unpasteurized fruit juices, were considered the healthiest option throughout the 1980s. Juice bars, health food stores, and even some supermarkets proudly advertised their juices as fresh squeezed and raw, highlighting that they hadn't undergone heat pasteurization, which might destroy nutrients. Orange juice squeezed to order. At breakfast restaurants, apple cider from local orchards, and fresh carrot juice from health food stores were all commonly consumed without pasteurization. Many people bought juices for home use, making their own raw juices as part of the health food movement. No warning labels were required, and consumers generally believed that unpasteurized juices were nutritionally superior to their processed counterparts. What few people considered were the potential microbial risks from juice pressed from unwashed or contaminated fruits and vegetables. A series of illness outbreaks in the 1990s, including a 1996 E. coli outbreak linked to unpasteurized apple juice that killed one child and sickened dozens, changed everything. The FDA subsequently required warning labels on unpasteurized juices and eventually mandated pasteurization or equivalent antimicrobial treatment for most commercial juices. Today, selling unpasteurized juice products without prominent warning labels about potential health risks is illegal, and interstate sale of unpasteurized juices is heavily regulated. Juice bars and retailers must either pasteurize their products or include clear warnings that would have been unthinkable in the health-conscious 1980s. Potassium bromate in bread throughout the 1980s. One of the most common ingredients in commercial bread was completely invisible to consumers but present in nearly every loaf on supermarket shelves. Potassium bromate. This flour treatment and dough conditioner strengthened gluten and promoted higher, more uniform rising. Major bread manufacturers relied on this additive to produce the perfectly shaped, fluffy loaves Americans preferred. Fast food hamburger buns, hot dog rolls, and even healthy whole wheat bread commonly contained potassium bromate, listed inconspicuously among other ingredients on the label. Bakeries loved it because it made dough easier to handle mechanically and resulted in consistent product. It was particularly valuable for mass production, where uniform results were essential. Home baking cookbooks sometimes even recommended bromate-treated flour for better results. However, research emerged linking potassium bromate to cancer in laboratory animals. While the baking process was supposed to convert the bromate to harmless bromide, studies showed that residual amounts often remained in finished products, especially if they were undercooked. By the early 1990s, many countries, including the United Kingdom, Canada, and the entire European Union, banned potassium bromate in food products. California later required warning labels on products containing it. Today, while the FDA has not completely banned potassium bromate, most major bread manufacturers have voluntarily phased it out due to consumer pressure and the need to sell globally. The ubiquitous bread ingredient of the 1980s would now trigger warning labels in some states and couldn't be sold in many international markets. Ephedra in dietary supplements. The 1980s fitness boom created an enormous market for supplements promising enhanced energy. Weight loss and athletic performance were some of the most popular benefits these products claimed. One of the most common ingredients in these products was ephedra, derived from the Chinese herb ma huang, which contains powerful stimulants called ephedrine alkaloids. Health food stores, gyms, and even some pharmacies sold ephedra-containing supplements under various brand names. These products were marketed for weight loss, increased energy, and improved athletic performance, becoming particularly popular among bodybuilders and those trying to lose weight quickly. Magazines like Muscle and Fitness regularly featured advertisements for ephedra supplements and fitness. Instructors often recommended them to clients looking for an extra edge. Since they were classified as dietary supplements rather than drugs, they escaped the strict FDA oversight applied to pharmaceuticals. By the late 1990s, mounting evidence linked ephedra to serious side effects, including heart attacks, strokes, and even deaths. The high-profile death of Baltimore Orioles pitcher Steve Beckler in 2003, attributed to ephedra use, brought national attention to the risks. In 2004, the FDA banned ephedra-containing dietary supplements nationwide. Today, selling supplements containing ephedra is illegal in the United States, with violations potentially resulting in product seizures and significant penalties. The once popular workout and weight loss supplements of the 1980s fitness scene would now be contraband. Lead-glazed pottery for food, colorful, handcrafted ceramic dishes and cookware were popular in 1980s American kitchens, with Mexican, Italian, and Spanish pottery particularly prized for their vibrant colors and artisanal quality. Many homes displayed these pieces were proudly displayed and used for serving or cooking food. Import shops, department stores, and tourist destinations sold these decorative but functional items. Bright yellow, orange, red, and blue glazes were especially popular, adding a touch of international flair to American dining tables. Some people even collected these pieces during vacations abroad. What most consumers didn't realize was that many of these traditional ceramics were fired with lead-based glazes, particularly those from countries with less stringent manufacturing regulations. The lead could leach into food, especially acidic items like tomato sauce, citrus juices, or vinegar-based dressings. As awareness of lead poisoning increased in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the FDA began testing imported ceramics more rigorously and establishing stricter limits for lead leaching. Some states, like California, implemented their own testing programs and warning requirements. Today, selling ceramic foodware that leaches lead above very low established limits is illegal in the United States. Products must either be certified lead-free or carry prominent warning labels stating they're for decorative use only. The colorful foreign pottery that Americans casually ate from in the 1980s would now potentially trigger import bans, product recalls, and significant penalties for sellers. Wild foraged mushrooms. During the 1980s, the rise of gourmet cuisine in America created a market for wild mushrooms like morels, chanterelles, and porcini. Restaurants proudly listed wild, harvested mushrooms on their menus, and a subculture of mushroom foragers supplied these establishments through informal networks. There were few regulations governing the sale of wild foraged mushrooms. Farmers markets, roadside stands, and even some specialty grocers would sell whatever local foragers brought in, often with minimal verification of the seller's expertise or the mushroom's identity. Cookbooks of the era encouraged readers to try foraging themselves, sometimes with insufficient warnings about look-alike toxic species. Weekend mushroom hunting became a hobby for adventurous food enthusiasts, and fall mushroom festivals celebrated the harvest with minimal oversight. As gourmet mushrooms gained popularity, cases of mushroom poisoning increased, with some resulting in liver failure or death when toxic species were misidentified. Health departments began taking notice of the unregulated trade in wild fungi. Today, selling wild foraged mushrooms is strictly regulated in most states, requiring either certification of foragers, inspection by trained mycologists, or limiting sales to specific, easily identified species deemed safe. The commercial sale of certain Wild mushroom species is completely prohibited in some jurisdictions. The casual wild mushroom marketplace of the 1980s would now potentially violate food safety regulations in many states. Caffeinated alcoholic beverages. The 1980s saw the rise of wine coolers and other sweetened alcoholic beverages, targeted at younger drinkers. Brands like Bartles and James became household names, and some manufacturers began experimenting with adding stimulants like caffeine to counter alcohol's depressant effects. These early caffeinated alcoholic drinks flew under the regulatory radar, often marketed as sophisticated alternatives to beer. The combination promised to keep partiers energetic while still enjoying alcohol's relaxing effects, essentially selling the ability to drink more without feeling as intoxicated. Bars sometimes created their own concoctions, mixing energy drinks with spirits years before commercial versions hit the market. By the late 1980s, trendy nightclubs began introducing the dangerous practice of mixing vodka with newly popular energy drinks. This combination was soon found to create a particularly hazardous situation. The caffeine in the energy drinks masked the sensation of intoxication without reducing the actual impairment caused by alcohol, leading people to drink much more than they normally would. This heightened risk-taking behavior went largely unnoticed until later studies revealed the danger. The problem reached its peak in the 2000s with products like Four Loko, but the foundation for this trend was laid decades earlier. Today, the FDA has effectively banned pre-mixed alcoholic drinks containing both alcohol and significant amounts of caffeine, deeming these combinations inherently unsafe. The caffeinated alcoholic beverages that appeared in the 1980s would now be illegal to sell. Another food safety issue arose during the 1980s: lead-soldered food cans. Throughout that decade, many of the canned goods Americans consumed daily were sealed with lead solder, a method that had been in use for decades. The thin seam where the metal sides of the can met was sealed with a lead-based material to prevent leakage and contamination. From canned vegetables and fruits to soups and condensed milk, it was possible that these items contained lead solder. Consumers had no way of knowing which cans used lead, as it was not disclosed on packaging. Lead soldering was especially common in imported canned goods, with the greatest risk posed by acidic foods such as tomatoes, citrus fruits, and some vegetables. These acidic foods could cause the lead to leach into the contents of the cans. Over time, as cans sat on store shelves, the amount of lead that migrated into the food increased. As studies revealed lead's harmful effects, especially concerning children's exposure, the FDA began to push for alternatives. By the late 1980s, many U.S. manufacturers voluntarily adopted safer welding methods. In 1995, the FDA officially banned lead-soldered food cans in the U.S. Today, importing or selling food in these cans is prohibited, with penalties and product seizures possible for violations. The canned goods that once lined American pantries in the 1980s would now be deemed too dangerous for consumption if produced using the same methods. Artificial sweeteners also became a hot topic during the diet-obsessed 1980s. Americans were eager to reduce sugar consumption while still satisfying their sweet tooth, and artificial sweeteners flooded the market. Saccharin and aspartame became widely used in the U.S., but another sweetener called cyclamate remained available in many countries despite being banned in the United States. Cyclamate had been banned in the U.S. in 1969 after studies linked it to bladder cancer in laboratory rats. However, many experts questioned the findings, arguing that the doses used in these studies were far higher than what any human would consume. The debate continued throughout the 1980s as the manufacturer sought to have cyclamate reinstated. Meanwhile, over 50 countries, including Canada, Australia, and most of Europe, continued to allow cyclamate in food products, considering it safe for typical consumption levels. This created an unusual situation where a substance banned in the U.S. was widely available just across the border. Some Americans traveling abroad, especially to Canada, would bring back products containing cyclamate. Specialty import shops even quietly sold these foreign diet products, and many Americans eagerly stocked up on cyclamate-sweetened sodas, candies, and tabletop sweeteners. Despite ongoing debate about the safety of cyclamate, it remains illegal in the United States to this day. Selling food or beverages containing cyclamate still carries the risk of product seizures and penalties. It's astonishing how quickly our understanding of food safety has evolved. Foods that were once common in American kitchens in the 1980s are now considered too dangerous for sale. It's a stark reminder that, in the blink of an eye, products we once considered safe can be reclassified as hazardous as our knowledge of science advances. Next time someone waxes nostalgic about the good old days of food, remember that many of those seemingly innocent meals carried risks we simply didn't understand back then. What's most striking is how fast these changes occurred. Foods that were everyday items just a few years ago became illegal contraband in no time. The evolution of food safety is a reminder that even the most familiar things can change. Who knows, the foods we consider normal today might be viewed as dangerous in the future. If you enjoyed this exploration of America's forbidden food history, be sure to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more content on how our eating habits have evolved over the decades. Thanks for watching.